So before we begin, I am going to be talking about psychosis today. So it's going to be less on kind of the general medical side of things. It's literally just my experience of having had an episode. So it's not going to be, like I say, a very technical psychiatric video, but also as it's going to be about psychosis, it could potentially be very triggering. So if you're not doing okay today, especially if you have a history of mental illness, sit this one out, or come back on another day. It's on the internet, it's not going to go anywhere. So I just wanted to preface anything with that caveat, I guess. Anywho, today I wanted to chat you through, based off a conversation that I had last night, about what psychosis actually feels like. So the first thing to tell you is that psychosis is actually very common, surprisingly common. I think if you'd asked me before I was unwell, and feel free actually to have a little moment and think to yourself, how common do you think it is? If you could think of a percentage or one in a blah blah blah, what would you think of? So for me, I would have said maybe 1 in 1,000, and potentially wouldn't have been hugely surprised if it were less common than that. I did just Google it just to double check, but psychosis affects about 3 in 100 people. For reference, instead of 3%, green eyes are slightly less common at about 2% of the population. So yeah, depends where you're looking, and it depends on the demographic you're looking at, but psychosis tends to come down onto certain factors. So some people have a genetic disposition, a family history. I'm not one of those people. None of my family, to my knowledge, have come even close to having a psychotic episode, so very lucky in that regard. But then also substance misuse can be a factor, can be a cause. Cannabis use has a link to psychosis. I was part of a study where they were trying to establish whether psychosis from non-cannabis related causes, or from non-cannabis users, was different from cannabis users who had psychosis. So yeah, and then also stress and sleeplessness. So for me it was stress and sleeplessness that caused my episodes. All that to say, it is common. It has causes beyond being drug related, which is what I probably thought if you'd asked me beforehand. I also completely believed that I was a dangerous person and I was a bad person because I'd had a psychotic episode. So just in case you needed to hear it today, you're not a bad person for being mentally unwell, and psychosis is, having experienced it, maybe I'm biased, but I think it's one of the worst human experiences, particularly on an acute psychiatric level, that a person can go through. It's one of the ones that we discuss the least, that is the least accepted, but it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything evil or bad. It happens to people you know. When I started talking publicly about my episode, I had quite a lot of people come to me and say that they had an episode as well and I had no idea, or that they had friends or family who had one or were experiencing one at the time, and it's just that we don't talk about it, so we don't have a clear grasp on how common it actually is. So that's to kind of convey, like I say, the normality in a way of psychosis. And I did write a blog post back in 2018, which was a year after my symptoms became acute, kind of going into as much depth as I was able to about what my episode manifested as, what my cause of my episode was. To recap on that blog post, mine came from some political events, and you'll see that a lot of the kind of delusional thinking, and we'll talk about that properly in a bit, I'm sure, tends to come from things that are part of like your healthy kind of psyche. So I've always really cared about global events. So it meant that for me, when Brexit happened, I'm a linguist, I thought I was going to be working with the EU at some stage, and I was I was about 23, I think, at the time, so it's a very uncertain sort of time of life. Like, I was definitely having a quarter-life crisis, and so it just felt like this massive, massive thing in a way that so many other people seemed to be either upset but not as upset by, or ambivalent, or just completely either didn't care or saw it as even something they were happy about. But yeah, I took this really, really, really hard, and I think it's partly that being a linguist, like, I've always felt kind of global events very like strongly, and I'm an INFJ as well. I've talked about this before online, but yeah, I just have always felt a real connection to, you know, bigger social events or issues. So that happened, and then also the 2016 Trump election happened after I'd spent a summer in the States. So Brexit happened while I was in the States, and then the Trump election happened while I was back in the UK. And I'd spent time like making friends, and I'd fallen in love with America. I still do love it, but for me, Trump was something I wasn't expecting, and something that I was very, very scared by. So those were two things that, all of these elements, if it hadn't been for all of them, I don't know what would have happened, but those were two really big things that kind of set me up. And then the third thing was that I started my own business, which I'm so happy that I did, and so proud of, and I still work for myself now, but I went about it in all of the wrong ways, and basically took the very, very stable mental health that I'd had until then, took it and didn't realise how fragile that was, even though prior to then I'd had some bumpy phases, like at university. I found it really difficult for a couple of things at school, but nothing major, nothing that required medication of any kind. I'd had counselling, but not long-term therapy, which I now have. My psychologist is amazing. But yeah, I'd see myself as someone that was really resilient. So it meant that when I was starting out and wanting to grow my business really well and really successfully, I was sure that the way to do this was to hustle, to get up early in the morning, to get on my desk as early as possible, and to leave it at the end of the day, and to feel that really, really kind of culturally ingrained pride at the fact that I was pushing myself, and I was pushing myself really, really, really hard, and that turned into stress, and that stress turned into poor sleep. But I would be frustrated that I hadn't slept very well, which would make me more stressed. But then also I felt this real sense of pride that, well, I slept for 5 hours last night, but look how much I got done. Well, I slept for 4 hours, but look what I got done. 3, 2, no hours, but look how much I've got done. And funnily enough, that wasn't sustainable in the slightest, and meant that I got very, very stressed, very, very stressed, and my psychosis was a bit strange because I didn't have voices, and I didn't have things that made it very obvious, or would have made it very obvious if I explained it to someone else what was wrong, And another thing about my episode, and from what other people I've spoken to as well have said, is that things feel so real, things feel so like concrete and tangible, and you don't have, like I didn't have for a very long time, I didn't have, and we're talking about probably of it being acute about 6 weeks. Before that, the downturn would have been about 6 months. But yeah, I just didn't grasp that something was wrong with me, and my delusional thinking, I didn't know it was delusional. So when some people have intrusive thoughts, they can think, oh my goodness, I'm having an episode of blah blah blah, but when you're very unwell, you don't have insight, so you don't know that you might be having something that you know is wrong. It's like the thought feels like a fact and nothing else. So yeah, so that was kind of how things started, and yeah, it turned into just this big field, this big period of time that I can't remember very well. And in some ways that's a good thing, because the bits that I do remember are very painful, and I'm very ashamed of parts of them. I was very ashamed before I met my psychologist. But then also the bits that I can remember are very painful, like I say, and it just means I have a very like murky sort of memory of what happened. Some people can remember absolutely nothing, some people can remember everything, and like none of the 3 categories, so everything, some stuff, nothing, none of those 3 are fun. And yeah, I don't know if there is any particular science as to why you can fall into those groups, but like I say, I was someone that had some stuff, and yeah, it took probably 6 weeks-ish before I realised that something was wrong with me. Like before then, I'd run away pretty much from my family. I was staying at friends, and I was functional. So even though the paranoia that I had around like being in danger from my family, even though that was there, I could still work and I could still have a conversation. And at one stage I took myself into hospital because I thought I was going to kill someone, and I don't think I actually communicated that particular thought with the staff, but I remember one of the nurses knew that something wasn't right and she was keeping an eye on me. But then the doctors came in and had conversations with me, and I was very lucid, and because I'd kind of float into things making sense and thinking rationally and being able to have normal conversations, then floating out and thinking, oh, I'm really dangerous or I'm in danger, it was hard to pick up on it. And like that nurse was the only person besides maybe my very, very close like friends and family, like the people that I was around kind of the most. She was the only person, and I spoke to a GP. I went and thought I had depression. She was the only one that knew something was wrong, so I'm very, very grateful to that nurse. I don't know if I'll ever be able to find her, but I am. Yeah, just this big window of time of some bits I remember, some of those bits I was lucid for, some of those bits I wasn't. And it took, like I say, about 6 weeks to 2 months before I went back to my mum and dad, because the insight had finally kicked in for me, and I feel like I was caught early enough that things didn't spiral to the stage where I stopped thinking that anything was wrong with me. Like some people can have it that they realise something's not right, but if you know, maybe if they go untreated, then they think that the world that they're seeing is the problem versus they themselves being unwell. So yeah, big 6 week window, and then my treatment program, the team that I've been seeing, that's been 3 years of care that's coming to an end at the end of May, and I'm very sad about that. yeah, so that's what the actual episode feels like. It feels like something that's very foggy, but the key things are that I don't have the resilience that I used to have. I have to be so careful about my sleep because as things have like subsided, my vulnerability has subsided as I get further away from my episode, but particularly early on, being sleepless would trigger me, and I would start to feel the kind of the early stages of being unwell again. So that's one thing I have to be so mindful of. My work-life balance, I'm just borderline religious about now, because I have to be. I have a work phone, I have a personal phone. I don't work in my bedroom. I do go to a co-working space, but obviously I'm not able to do so right at this moment, given COVID circumstances. But I have that as an option to take me out of my home, get some separation, and so work has to be set in such a way, because that was an area that had really made me so vulnerable, and been such a big cause. The other thing besides my work was global events. So this current situation with coronavirus, initially, I'm doing fine now, which is why I can make this video, but initially I found it extraordinarily triggering. It was horrible, and I have, for this entire time after my episodes anyway, avoided the news. I just can't watch the news anymore, and I'm off Twitter for the same reason. But I went from being someone that was very, sorry, I'm a bit uncomfortable, so I'm shifting around. Being someone that was very politically engaged and wanted to follow the news very, very closely. I now, like I say, I can't do that. I get unwell or get the feelings that were like the early stages of feeling psychotic. But related to global events being one of my triggers, I had a lot of delusional thoughts around, the news. So among a big old murky mess was feeling that something was happening with Donald Trump, and I remember lying in bed and I thought I could feel like nuclear bombs exploding in Korea, and I felt that they were so strong that the world was being shifted on its axis and we were going to spiral away from the sun. And then also I had things around thinking that I was dangerous for having run away from my parents and from my family, so I thought people were going to try and kill me, and so I'd watch the TV and I thought it was fake TV, like fake news as well, that they were screening Pointless, the show. It's a British TV quiz show, screening that to just our household, and then to every other household they were screening things about me being very dangerous. I also, not related to global events, and thankfully something that it was so kind of removed from the reality that I got to put it to bed very quickly, but I thought I was a heroin user, that I had a substance addiction. No basis for that whatsoever, but some of it was definitely based on schemas being deep-rooted schema is a psychological term, but deep-rooted beliefs that you have are surrounded by memory, so they feel like fact. So many delusions are kind of based on that. And so to avoid the cause of that delusional thinking, I have to avoid the news. And I don't even like the word delusional either. I don't like delusional or delusions, and I don't like psychotic, and I don't like schizophrenic or schizophrenia or schizo, because they to me just don't feel like medical terms anymore. They don't feel that they have the kind of gravity and, you know, sensicalness around them now that we do attach so much baggage to them. So like I say, that whole like danger, you know, perspective and what have you. So yeah, that's kind of the big delusions that, like I say, mean that I have to avoid the news, too much work, and just stress in general. But one thing I did want to cover was what a trigger feels like, because it's not as simple as, and I think it's kind of common parlance now, it's not as simple as getting upset by a certain thing. So I can be upset by many things and not feel any sort of, you know, psychological effect beyond feeling sad, feeling angry. It's not an emotional thing for me. What being triggered for me feels like, in a way, it's kind of like a detachment from reality, which would make perfect sense. I'll sort of see a fact, like, again, could be a tweet, could be a news article, that will pull me out of that moment. And for me, it used to sort of spiral into those thought patterns, but now I just get the sensation. So for me, that is being pushed like a massive weight against my chest, and not in my stomach, short of breath, and then my vision goes a bit strange. So I can be looking at someone or something, and right now my focus is on just this camera, but if I'm feeling triggered, I'll look at the camera, but all of my field of vision I can see. So usually our eyes don't care about peripherals 90% of the time, but like I say, I will look and I'll feel overwhelmed. This is saying you feel overwhelmed, again, is an emotion rather than a psychological, I guess, process or sensation. But it's very specific, and I'd never ever felt it before I was unwell, and so much of this were things that I'd never experienced before being unwell, which is why I think it's good to talk about what it's like, because we don't have conversations like this often enough. So yeah, that's what being triggered is like. I'm going to stop here just to having covered what it's like, but I can do a follow-up video, even, you know, maybe multiple ones, like a psychosis Q&A could be really cool. But stay well. There are definitely options out there if you are feeling unwell at the moment, and the main reason why I got better is because I asked for help. So another time I can talk about treatment, etc. But take care, and I'll see you again soon.